going to be talking about showing and not telling. Now, with this lesson, you may have heard it several times, or you may have never heard this. And if you've never heard it, great, then this is the lesson for you. If you have heard of this before, then I would say still listen, just because I'm going to talk about some concepts that are related to showing and not telling that will help improve your writing, irregardless of if you don't really struggle with this. Alright, so first of all, we're going to talk about what is showing versus telling. So, telling is when you state facts. For example, I was going to do first person, but I prefer third. She has blue eyes. You're stating a fact. You're telling us that she has blue eyes. Whereas showing is something like her blue eyes sparkled, and then add something like with mischief. Now that is showing. The reason it's showing is because it is showing you that her eyes are blue through her eyes doing an action, sparkling, or doing another action like glancing, or looking someone up and down. It gives you an action that you're following, so instead of just stating it like a fact in a textbook, it feels more natural and we see it as a scene. Because when we're watching a movie, we see things and we're like, oh, her blue eyes are sparkling with mischief, I wonder what she's up to. We're seeing that and we're thinking that. We're not thinking she has blue eyes like a robot or like a historical textbook. In historical textbooks, they have to be in 1984, they had this battle. Rather than showing in a movie, they are battling and it's all crazy and it's clearly in Civil War times because of their uniforms or whatever. That's showing. Now, the reason showing versus telling is important is because showing helps give us more depth to the story, gives us more meat, and helps us feel more connected to the characters than the story itself, and feel more immersed in the world rather than feeling, again, like it's kind of being iterated to us like a textbook. Now, that being said, like I said, I'm going to talk about some things that people can struggle with aside from that. That being said, white room syndrome, and I call it blob character syndrome. Now, what are these? White room syndrome is when the setting is not described. So there's no setting. And the blob character syndrome is when the character is not described either. So the problems here is with white room syndrome, you can have moments where you're like, oh yeah, she's in a busy street, and you're like, you never said that before, and so your reader is pulled out of the story because they're like, I wasn't imagining a busy street. Same thing with blob character syndrome. With blob character syndrome, your character is constantly molding and morphing and changing like a blob because of the fact that you haven't described it beforehand. So for example, they might have red hair and blue eyes, but if you don't tell us they have red hair and blue eyes, maybe I'll imagine them as African American, and then whoopsie, I'm sitting here imagining her as an African American with, beautiful mahogany skin, and instead you're like, guess what, she's pale and has red hair 5 chapters in. I'm sitting there going, this character becomes a blob now because I'm trying to meld my vision and your vision together. That's a problem. You need to make sure that you don't have these because it can pull your reader out of the story. And obviously, we don't want to pull your reader out of the story. That is one of the least things that people ever want. Now, that being said, we're going to talk about white room syndrome first. With white room syndrome, the best thing that you can do with white room syndrome is to describe your setting as soon as you change settings. If your character goes from point A to point B, you don't necessarily have to describe the walk there, unless it's important. However, once you get to point B, you have to describe it. So, for example, in Percy Jackson, when he's at the cabin with his mom, he describes the cabin, right? You wouldn't just say, he's in a cabin with his mom. Okay, we get a basic idea of a cabin, But then he's like, it's by the ocean. Maybe we were imagining a cabin in the mountains. That's where white room syndrome is a problem. So, when to describe? Immediately upon changing settings. If you change a setting, you have to describe the new setting. Even if it's just a carriage to get from point A to point B, you have to give at least a minor description of that. Maybe we were imagining a car, and you just say they get from point A to point B. If it's a carriage, specify it's a carriage. And you don't have to do like, it is a carriage telling. You can do showing, where it's the carriage bounced along the road as she scowled out the window. That gives you a basic setting with one sentence. Same thing with if you're describing the cabin of Percy Jackson. If I remember correctly, it's by the ocean and it kind of is a little bit beautiful, scenic, but it's not too crazy because obviously very poor. Could be incorrect. Maybe I'm thinking of the movie. So as a result of that, with the Adult Writers Club, the thing that you want to do with avoiding white room syndrome is make sure that you describe it immediately. So when you describe things immediately, you want to make sure that even if it's just one sentence of description, you show rather than tell, and you demonstrate these ideas. With demonstrating these ideas, you want to make sure that you have, first of all, what is it, a city? Is it a suburb if you're outside? Is it a countryside? These are all important things if you're outside. If you're inside, you're going to want to mention, is it cluttered? Is it clean? Is it somewhere in between? And you're also going to want to mention types of things that they have, like is it modern? Is it a castle? These are all really important to avoid white room syndrome. Especially with showing and not telling, you want to make sure that you demonstrate how it feels. Now, you may not know what it feels like to live in a castle in the 1800s. However, with living in a castle in the 1800s, it's probably going to be a little bit drafty, right? There's not going to be perfect heating and air conditioning. There's also probably not going to be any indoor plumbing. So these are things that you could use to show the fact that it is a castle without saying, we are living in a castle. The next thing you can do is like with cluttered, instead of saying the room is cluttered, you can say she tripped and fell over a potted plant and immediately face planted into her old stack of CDs. Now that tells you it's cluttered. Or if it's very, very clean, you can say something like she sat on the couch ever so delicately to avoid causing any creases in the couch. Now that tells you that she's a very nitpicky person and that she likes things to be clean. Or she readjusts the pillow to make sure that it's just so. Those all say that it's cluttered or clean. Now with a city or a suburb, that's a little bit trickier. If you're doing a major big city, I would say, irregardless of time of day or night, you're going to have lots of noise, you're going to have lots of cars passing by, you're going to have lots of lights flashing. I would say flashing lights and city type noises are going to be your best bet. Meanwhile, if you're doing a suburb, I would say it's going to be a little bit quieter, but you're still going to have like a sidewalk and things like that. So maybe running down the sidewalk, breeze blowing through your hair, if you're hearing a few crickets, hearing someone taking their garbage out, those are all ways to show that it's a suburb. Meanwhile, if it's a countryside, basically you're going to act like it's in the middle of nowhere, except maybe there's a few houses dotted along in the distance or something like that. But you're walking along a dirt road. That's going to show you that it's more countryside, more than likely. Now, if you're walking along a dirt road and it just happens to be a bike path next to a suburban area, again, you're going to want to show that, going to make sure that it transitions, and because it generally does, right? On a bike path, you're not just like, it's dirt and one nature, and then it's immediately suburb. There's kind of a transitioning into that area. All right, now, why showing and not telling in the setting is important is because you want to make sure that you immerse them in the setting. The best way to immerse them in the setting is to use all 5 senses to the best of your ability. Now, obviously, you can't use all 5 all the time. For example, you probably aren't tasting the air 24/7. Therefore, the setting is not going to be as much of an issue there. However, you probably are smelling things, you probably are seeing things, you probably are touching things. As a result, you can use those senses to help illuminate the reader to your world and how it looks. Alright, the next thing that we're going to be talking about is blob characters. Now, how to avoid blob character syndrome. With blob characters, you immediately, to avoid this, are going to show and not tell a description of the character within the first paragraph. And especially if you're reintroducing a new character. If you're introducing an old character, you don't need to do it again. Generally, you might do it once or twice, but most of the time, you're going to want a description of the character in the first time that you meet them, and then after you meet them, every time after that, you don't really need it anymore. However, if you don't describe them immediately upon meeting them, then you're going to have a little bit of a hard time having the reader imagining what you're imagining, and you tend to have trouble with that. As a result of that, with blob character syndrome, the best, after you describe it in the beginning, the best way to do it with showing and not telling is, again, action. So, sparkling eyes, running their hand through their hair, or if you want to do setting and character, you can do the wind blowing through their hair, or different things like that. With that being said, you want to make sure that you mention hair color, eye color, and skin color most of the time. Have a great day, guys. Thank you for coming. You want to make sure you mention hair, I already said that, hair, skin, and eye color. You also might want to mention height or age if they're important. Generally though, with hair color, that's going to give a nice indicator of age unless they're an immortal, in which case you're definitely going to want to clarify that. However, if you have a person with silver hair and they're not an immortal, then most likely they're going to be on the older side. Or if they have bright blue hair, then maybe they're dyeing their hair, and so you also want to identify age, because anyone can dye their hair at any age. So with blob character syndrome, those are just ways to avoid that, making sure that you clarify things like that. Now again, how to show age. This one's a toughie because of the fact that there are lots of different things that people do. Like I said, dyeing your hair. Sure, that's primarily a teen thing, but I've seen a lot of people who aren't teens dye their hair. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just a teen thing. As a result of that, the best way to do age, in my opinion, is to show their circumstances. So, for example, like with setting, if you have them at a high school, most likely they're going to be anywhere from age 15 to age 18. And then if you describe that they're a senior, we automatically assume 17 or 18. And if you describe they're a junior, and they're just like, oh, and the best way to show that would be like, oh, I can't wait to get out of this place, I'll be graduating next year. That shows that they're a junior. Then we assume more of a 17-year-old age range. Then if you're like, I can't believe I'm just starting high school, I'm so nervous, that's a good way to show that they're new to high school, so probably 15 or 16. And then so on and so forth. There's also different ways with adults. If they have, you want to make sure that you're careful with kids. You don't assume that just because someone has kids that they're young or old. That's not a thing. As a result of that, make sure that when you clarify age for that, you clarify, like, are there wrinkles around their eyes? Did they have kids later in life and so they're a little bit on the older side? Or are there kids and going off to college and so their last kid is going off to college and they had 8 kids and so they're a little bit older because of the fact that they had 8 kids? Or is it that they're super, super young and that they had a teen pregnancy and so they're like 20 but their kid's also like 10, and so it's like, well, that was bad. They're 30 and their kid's like 10, and it's like, whoa, that's a interesting gap. That was another bad example. Sorry, I'm trying to come up with stuff off the top of my head. With blob character syndrome, you just want to make sure that you are showing immediately upon meeting someone, and that you're showing it based on circumstances and actions, not necessarily saying they are poor or they are 45. You're showing it based on how they look and how they act and where they're living. For example, with poverty, if you're saying that they're living in a shack on the street, that definitely demonstrates poverty. Whereas if they're living in a rich mansion, they're either pretending to be rich or they are rich. And you can discover that later. Alright, the last thing that I want to mention is why showing and not telling is important with characters, specifically with fixing blob character. The reason why is because it immerses ourselves in the story. I know I said this last time, but it's very true. If you just state facts like she is blonde, she has blue eyes, she has freckles, she wears white dresses, I don't know. That makes it really, really hard to be able to distinguish characters because they all seem very factual. They all seem very finite. And so if you describe the next character as he has brown eyes, he has brown hair, it starts to get a little boring, and so we don't remember that. So later when you're like, he has brown hair, you're like, oh, I guess he does have brown hair, huh? And you don't remember it because you're bored. Those descriptions aren't alluring to you. The best way to write alluring descriptions is showing and not telling. And same thing with fixing blob character syndrome and white room syndrome. Now, if you have any questions about either of these things, please let me know. I also want to clarify quickly before I finish this that dialogue is a great way to demonstrate character. You absolutely can use dialogue as a way to show and not tell. With using dialogue, you can use it to expand the idea of emotion. You can use it to show circumstance. So for example, if you wanted to, that would be another good way to show age. If the kid is talking to his parent and he's like, well, I bet that you were only 16 when this crazy thing happened, and the person's like, how old do you think I am? Like, and he's like, I don't know, 402, and the parent like lightly slacks them on the head, and they're chuckling and things like that. Like, that helps make it so that you're demonstrating kind of through witty banter what is going on with the ages and what their relationship is like, and you're showing multiple dimensions of a scene through dialogue and through showing and not telling. If you have any other questions about showing and not telling, please feel free to email me or leave a comment. Bye!